Welcome to our very first webinar with Easter seals. On this topic of CVI, we are very excited to be presenting this to you and to get going. This has been a little while in the making. So before we get started with all of that, let us introduce ourselves, and then Susan will talk a little bit about the program. So my name's Mindy Ely. I am the research lead on our ALEX project, which is what you're going to hear about in just a minute. I'm also the assistant professor at Illinois State University in the Low Vision and Blindness program. And in the field or related to CVI, I have many hats that I wear within the field, but it all boils down to just trying to help the field or be part of this conversation around CVI, cerebral visual impairment, and how we can address the needs of children and families, how we can advance the research, how we can find the best ways to help kids and their families. Sue, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. My name is Susan Sullivan, and I am currently the clinic lead for a new program on CVI. And I've been a TVI. I'm working with children with blindness and visual impairments for almost 30 years. 10 of that was spent as a developmental therapist vision in the early intervention system. So we are both so excited that you're joining us. Okay, so this is the inaugural learning webinar courtesy of Easter Seal Central Illinois' ALEX program for cerebral visual impairment. The ALEX program is named after a young man with CVI whose family has fought for years to raise awareness, education, and multidisciplinary support for this population. This first webinar is intended to be an introduction to cerebral visual impairment, aimed at professionals who do not have a great deal of experience with this diagnosis. It is the first in a sequential series intending to increase understanding of this very complex diagnosis. So stay tuned. At the end tonight, we are going to ask you to complete a survey that will help guide us as we create new and the next learning webinars. Okay, so I mentioned the word multidisciplinary. That's defined as combining or involving several academic disciplines or professional specializations in an approach to a topic or problem. So that is really our goal for this program, is to strengthen the knowledge and the support between every child's entire educational team. So this slide shows who we have in attendance this evening. So we have 26 TVIs. We have 2 orientation and mobility specialists. We have 2 dual certified TVIs, teacher for children with visual impairment, and orientation mobility specialists. We have 8 physical therapists. We have 7 occupational therapists. We have 3 special education teachers. We have 2 nurses, and then we have a group of other individuals, including assistive technology people, Easter Seal staff, general education teacher, paraprofessional, social worker, and speech and language. So we want to thank you all for coming. This is exactly what we want, is an intermixing of different disciplines.
Okay, so we want to start out by just kind of giving an overview of what CVI is. And so let's first talk about the medical side of it, or the physiological side. You know that the visual system, usually when we think of the visual system, we think of the eyeball itself. So the eyeball is there to capture information. It takes that information and then that information goes back into the brain. When that information gets to the brain, the brain needs to be able to process it. CVI, cerebral visual impairment, is when there is difficulty with the visual system with the brain processing that information. And so when we think of an issue that is within the eyeball itself, we think of ocular, we call that an ocular visual impairment. When we think of an issue with the processing, then we call that a neurological visual impairment, and specifically, we're talking about cerebral visual impairment. So when the issue is within the brain, it has to do with us. We're calling it a cerebral visual impairment. So it's important that we understand a little bit about cerebral visual impairment as providers, as professionals that are working with children. Cerebral visual impairment is now the leading cause of visual impairments in children. This pie graph that you're looking at it comes from Babies Count. Babies Count is a national census that is taken basically through teachers of the visually impaired. So when you really look at a teacher for the visually impaired's caseload, and this specifically Babies Count is looking at numbers that are coming from providers that are serving children ages birth to 3. So in that early intervention group, the numbers, which have been pretty consistent for many years now, are showing about 29% of those kids are diagnosed with cerebral visual impairment. 29%, that's a large percentage of the total group. It is very likely that as a professional working with children, if you have a child with a visual impairment on your caseload, if you're working with kids with visual impairment on your caseload, that you may have some with cerebral visual impairment. And that is just fostering our need to make sure people understand what this diagnosis is, and understand what it means to their practice. And so that is why we are wanting to emphasize increase of education and increase of our understanding of what to do with these kids. Diagnostics is not straightforward related to cerebral visual impairment. Usually when we think of diagnostics, there's a test. When you have visual impairment, you go in, you take a test, and you figure out what's going on. With cerebral visual impairment, it's not nearly as straightforward. Usually we consider several data sources to figure that out. And in general, there seems to be an eye exam that shows a child is not perceiving visual information, but their visual function does not match with what is seen in the eyeball itself. In other words, they're having some hindrance to their visual function, yet it doesn't match any impairments that are observable within the eyeball. So that would rule out an ocular visual impairment. And then secondly, there's typically some kind of history of neurologic involvement. That could be loss of oxygen at birth. That's actually the most common reason for it. There could be a brain bleed that has put pressure and damaged centers within the brain. So there's a list of different things that could have happened in the child's history that would cause a cerebral visual impairment. It could happen at any age. So there could be difficulties prior to birth, at the birth, or after. So even a traumatic brain injury can cause a cerebral visual impairment. So an eye exam that doesn't match visual function, a history of some neurological involvement or damage, and then there are some markers of visual function. And Christine Roman has developed 10 characteristics that are used to identify kids with CVI. There are other lists of functions related to vision that are indicative of CVI. So those 3 things kind of have to come together in combination to suggest that a child might have CVI. But it's not straightforward. It's not just one particular test. There has been look at using data from MRIs for VEPs and fMRIs, and I want to talk about those just a little bit. First of all, do you go see an ophthalmologist or do you go see a neurologist? Quite honestly, both could play a role in the diagnostics. The tests that have been used have been MRIs. MRI is an image of the brain structure itself, and that has been used in the past. It doesn't give all the information. They have also the VEP, which is a visually evoked potential. It looks at electrical activity within the brain, and it does give some information that will help with diagnosis, but it can't be the only piece of information. Another piece that is being used more and more is functional MRIs. A functional MRI is designed to measure the activity within the brain when the brain is at work. And so typically a child will be involved in some kind of visual activity that you would expect them to respond to. As a result, they can measure blood flow and oxygen levels within the brain, and that gives some indication of lack of activity, which would suggest that there's an issue with the visual processing. The Lofty Meribet and Corinna Bauer out of Harvard Medical School have been doing a lot with fMRIs to try to take that piece of technology and use it not only for diagnostics, but also to help us figure out the results of some kinds of interventions. And so that's very exciting on the educational front, to be able to go a step further and think about how can we gather data that will show us whether things are making a structural difference within the visual system. At the New Mexico School for the Blind, they've also been doing some work where they're using fMRIs to measure activity, putting children through some interventions over periods of time, and then doing new fMRIs and comparing those results. So again, the research is kind of coming along as we try to figure out how to measure progress and in kids, and what we are doing that might impact the way a child is learning and seeing. I wanted to bring this up, these categories up. So Gordon Dutton has suggested, Gordon Dutton is an ophthalmologist out of the UK who's done loads and loads of work around CVI, and he has suggested a framework that might help us understand CVI a little bit better. And first of all, when you think of kids with CVI, how do they see? What do they look like? There's actually, they can look very different. So some kids can have profound physical and cognitive delays and have CVI. Some kids can have mild physical and cognitive or no cognitive delay at all and CVI. Some kids have no other disability and CVI. Gordon Dutton has suggested using a framework in that we are differentiating between those populations, suggesting that perhaps there is a different way to assess the different populations, and there is likely a different intervention model that is better for the different populations. So this is something that we would like to explore. It's a framework that is out there that people are kind of looking at. But regardless of the additional disabilities or lack thereof that are paired with a child in a child that also has CVI, the impact on visual function of CVI is severe anyway. So in other words, if you have CVI and no other disabilities, it's quite impactful on the way you function. The same as if you have multiple disabilities and CVI, there's going to be significant impact on your visual function. So we can't let the degree of additional disabilities dictate the impact of CVI. All populations need to be considered as we are looking at the best assessment and the best strategies in working with these kids. The other thing I'll say about that is, my guess is that I think the numbers of kids with no other disabilities and CVI right now are pretty low, but I think those numbers are going to grow as we better understand how to diagnose kids with CVI. So that's something to keep your eye on. I know, as just talking with teachers in the field, I don't have any data behind this, but just my own anecdotal evidence is that teachers are seeing more and more kids that have milder other disabilities and CVI, and we need to figure out what to do to help those kids. And that's probably an area we have the least amount of information on right now. So just to give you a really brief overview of what's going on in the brain. Okay, so remember, this is a series of webinars, so I'm not going to go very deep into this, but I want to give you, I only have one slide on this because I'm not going to go very deep, but I want to give you a brief overview. When we think about how the visual system understands vision, information comes into the brain through the eyes. It eventually gets back to the back of the eye, which is the occipital lobe. That's not the end of it. From there, there's loads of connections that have to happen to have an image that is perceived, understood, and can be acted on. So we talk about a dorsal stream and we talk about a ventral stream. That dorsal stream, which is typically, which in location, we're talking about the structures that are more in the top of the brain, and the ventral stream, which are the structures that are more on the bottom of the brain. That's probably really simplistic, but you get the idea. That dorsal stream, well, let me start with the ventral. That ventral stream is doing the work of identifying objects, recognizing faces, recognizing textures and shapes. So it is helping you to identify things. But and so when you're reading words, you're identifying letters, you're identifying words. That identification is this ventral stream. And then the dorsal stream is doing the work to put that together. So you have an image and you need to understand where it is in space, where your body is in space, how to put those things together, all the little pieces of the visual scene, or all the little pieces of the object itself. That putting it all together and understanding the spatial relation behind all of that is taking place in the dorsal stream. So an injury to any one part of the brain can impact function in a very different way. And when we assess, when we're working with kids, we need to know what the impact of visual function is. And so if we happen to have, if we get to the point where we can get that information from a medical evaluation, that's one thing. Most of that information right now comes from our functional evaluations. So figuring out what the child is having trouble seeing and what where their difficulties are and what supports they need in order to be able to interpret their visual environment. But some kids can't recognize faces, some kids can't recognize objects, some kids can't see two things at once. Some kids cannot shift gaze between two objects. Some kids can't plan routes and cannot put something in a drawer, close the drawer, and then they have no idea which drawer in the dresser they just put that object in. So that planning, that spatial planning is not there. So the visual system is very complex and it takes a lot of topography of the brain. So all of that to say, sorry, I can't get my, Sue, can you click? Because I can no longer click to the next one. Oops.
That should be your next.
Thank you, thank you.
Sure.
So all of that to say that we believe that the visual system is a complex mechanism. However, there is evidence within the literature that when we enrich a visual environment, when we give kids lots of experiences, especially if those experiences are meshed with motor, that we actually can see gains in visual function. And again, is that neuroplasticity? We think that we actually are changing those connections, but the measuring tools are really hard, and nobody is certain what the extent of the reorganization is. So the research that's out there is very limited. That's exciting in that there's a lot of room for partnership between practitioners and researchers to figure these things out. And that's the exciting work that is happening around the country right now. And that's kind of blowing up. But we have a long way to go. And we'll see where we get to. But we want to help these kids. And I think working together, we can make that happen.
Okay, so teachers for children with visual impairment are taught the science of CVI, and we learn about working with medical professionals, but often parents, caregivers, or other members of the educational team are the first to notice some red flags that indicate that something is not right visually. So I wanted just to kind of touch on some of those behaviors that people typically see first, especially in the youngest children. So they're definitely not using their vision in the same way as other children the same age. So a parent that has had another child may notice and compare their child's visual functioning with the other child and notice that there's something that just is not right. The child may either light gaze, which is where they're totally attracted to the sunlight outside the window or a bright light in the house or above them, or they can have photophobia, which is the opposite, where that bright light is very almost appears to be painful to them and they don't want to look at lights. So it can be one or the other of that. No blink is very common in kids with CVI because of the slow processing. They are not able to see something coming towards them rapidly. They don't process it fast enough to get that blink. So that is definitely a red flag. A lot of parents will say that their child is looking through them, which is basically the child not recognizing their face, not making eye contact, because the face is one of the most complicated things that that we look at in life, and most little kids are drawn to that, but kids with CVI, it's so complex for them to see the eyes moving, the mouth moving, the hair moving, that that really restricts that interaction with faces. Okay, so other possible visual behaviors also include poor depth perception, influencing a child's ability to accurately reach for a target. It's very difficult for kids with CVI to do two things at once. If they look at something, they may have to look away and then actually reach for it because it's so hard for their brains to let them do the same two things at once. We see a lot of fatigue in kids with CVI caused by overstimulation, and it could be visual stimulation where you're in a very busy room, but it also can be auditory overstimulation in a playground, in a park, in a party of family members, that they could become totally overwhelmed, and then their vision kind of shuts off and they aren't able to use their vision as well as they can in a quiet room. They have short visual attention span, and again, that could be caused by that fatigue. And then another term is prosopagnosia, which is also called face blindness, which is the inability to discriminate faces. There are many, many cases of children who are not able to recognize their own moms. They will recognize them by their voice or by their smell or by their haircut or maybe a pair of glasses, but they will not be able to pick them out of a crowd in a busy environment. Okay, so every child with CVI is unique. We've been saying this for years, and that's why I have the puzzle pieces on the screen, because it's putting a puzzle together. We need to get to know the child through different assessments, through lots of conversation with caregivers, not only parents, but the people that work with them in the schools, bus drivers, friends, grandparents, anyone who can offer some insight into the child's interactions. And then we need to observe them in many different environments, both familiar environments and unfamiliar environments, in noisy rooms and quiet rooms, indoors, outdoors, because vision can be affected by so many environmental considerations that we need to take note of that. And that's the way that we're going to be able to set appropriate goals and plan interventions for these kids. Okay, so there's a lot of number of things that need to be considered when visual learning is expected. The first is the physical environment. So we have to think about lighting in the room. We talked just a second ago about, kids using light as a distractor. If there's a bright light coming in and that child, that's all they want to look at, you're going to have to try to hide that light in order to get them to visually start to attend to something else. Or if the light is bright and uncomfortable, then you're going to have to find another strategy to use. Work surfaces are basically, if you're thinking about a wheelchair tray or a high chair tray, something like that, and you're trying to get the child to pick up food, you want to make sure that there isn't a lot of other things on the tray at the same time. You may need to address contrast, with a yellow spoon on a black mat, so the spoon stands out. And then the positioning of the child and the materials. We work with physical therapists a lot to get that correct position, one for their best usage of their arms and their heads for control, but also for comfort, to make sure that they're not so uncomfortable in the position that they're in that they can't focus on using their vision at that time. And we think about the physical materials, the complexity of objects. There may be a choice of 3 balls. One may be completely a red ball with no other colors. One may have 2 colors on it, and one may be polka dots. There's a lot of kids that would only really be able to interact with that red ball because it only has one color, and one color objects, it's easier for a child to understand what it is. It doesn't have different colors to look like different pieces of that object. We think about complexity of array. This is when you may only want to provide one object to a child at a time. You want to block out with, have a clear or a clean, uncluttered background, maybe a black blanket or a black cloth or a board or something like that. And then you have to kind of determine, can the child see one thing at a time? Can you bring in a second thing and give them a choice, or does that totally throw them off for being able to use their vision? And then I mentioned contrast a second ago. Contrast is a big thing where you definitely have to look at how easy it is to see things. I know when I go into a restaurant and you look at a menu and the contrast of the letters on the background, it makes it very difficult for me to see. So think about a child who has issues with contrast. You have to make sure that you have something that's completely the different color I mentioned before, yellow and black or red on white or something like that, so that you can help them to see it. We really have to pay attention to the sensory environment. I already talked about auditory, where that can be a noisy room, but it could also be music playing in a child's classroom that makes it impossible for them to focus on the lesson that you're doing. So again, this is another reason why the whole multidisciplinary team works, so that everyone is aware of the child's needs so they can adapt the environment as needed. And then again, I put positioning again because it's so important to make sure the child is in a comfortable position, and that we know how he uses his vision in different positions. State of alertness, okay? Is the child drowsy? Is he overstimulated? And then we have to kind of learn some techniques and strategies to get them to that actual level where they're able to learn. Providing visual access, that has to do with everything about where you place the item to how many items you have. Does it need backlit, like using a light box, or is it better for the child just to see it in front of a blackboard? And then olfactory, I always include that too, the sense of smell, because I've had students that if someone was wearing a strong perfume or a lotion, or if there was someone cooking in the room, that their visual performance was decreased immensely. And finally, relationships with people. Okay, so I wanted to talk about proximity. Some kids do not react well when someone's very close to them. Sometimes they react even worse when there's several people close to them. So to kind of think about, the distance, the actual distance that you are to the child. And then the tone and the volume and the speed of your voice. When you think about visual processing, you also have to think about the possibility that the child is also having trouble processing hearing, what they hear. So sometimes we need to speak much slower so that the child has time to process what it is that we're saying. And then we have to give them wait time. And that's something that's determined through assessment. But wait time is so important because of that processing. You have to know if it takes a child 5 seconds, to be able to actually physically look at what you're giving them, count in your head. You present the object and then you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they may look at it. It seems like a long time when we're working with kids, but that's part of having the kids be successful, is from learning what their wait time is and then providing that to them. And then face identification, we talked about that a little bit too, but sometimes we'll have to maybe have a symbol or something. If we wear a red scarf, or every time we go see that child, then that child would maybe be able to recognize us a lot quicker than if we just expect them to recognize our face, because it really is a common problem that the faces are very hard to identify. Okay. So because every child has different needs, there should be a multidisciplinary team. The ALEX program for cerebral visual impairment was established in 2020 thanks to the tireless efforts of ALEX's family and care team. The ALEX program will bring together some of the nation's foremost experts in CVI to provide access to our experts closer at home here in Illinois, increase awareness of CVI among professionals, and provide resources for those working alongside those impacted.
CVI is when the visual system has a hard time interpreting what is visually seen. It's nothing to necessarily do with the eyes. That's the unique thing about it. It's really an issue with the brain, and it's the connections between the brain and the eyes, really interpreting what you're seeing
being able to file that and retrieve it and bring it back.
CVI is the only visual impairment that we can really help children improve in the way they use their vision.
Teachers often get to be the first one to see a child have a visual reaction. And so you will see the joy on the parent's face when they realize my child is not blind, my child can see.
Kids with CVI can present in many, many different ways, but there's some things that we frequently see with kids with CVI. A lot of times when the environment is really busy, they have a hard time using their vision. And so we talk about visual clutter being something that is difficult for kids.
An interdisciplinary team approach to the evaluation, treatment, and support of children with CVI, it is absolutely necessary. In order for children with CVI to have the best outcomes, they need to have consistent strategies and supports across all settings and environments.
Because their brain is trying to figure out what they are seeing. If you show them one object on a plain background, so you've reduced clutter, and just wait, just give them a minute, their brain is doing some work to try to figure out what it is that they're seeing.
There's no one set treatment protocol. It's really important to have that individualized, multidisciplinary assessment to identify what is that child's individual needs and where are their skills at and the best way to provide the care to them so they have the best outcomes.
Each child that you work with CVI is completely different. I always look at them as being a puzzle box, and you have to find the right keys to unlock the puzzle that can allow that child to learn. Just gives you a great sense of accomplishment when you see that child making progress.
If there's one thing that I could tell someone is not to ignore it. If you feel very strongly that something is there and somebody's telling you it's not, maybe they're not the right provider. We need to find the next one.
Can you imagine as a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle that you walk into a room and the child that you love so much doesn't recognize you or isn't aware that you're there? And then all of a sudden through, rehabilitative strategies, educational strategies, that child has now learned how to use their vision. And you walk into the room and you get to experience seeing that child look at their parent for the first time or recognize their parent in a photo album. There is just nothing more powerful than the human connection. And every child and parent or caregiver should have that right to have the opportunity for the most potential to have that connection with people they love. And I think at the heart of the passion of why are we doing this and why is this important is when you know that there are strategies that can help kids have that connection, there's just nothing more powerful. Everybody deserves that. There's never a better time to do that, right, than right now, as soon as we know that there's a need.
We're, maybe starting small, but we're starting, and it's going to be exciting to watch.
It's time to make the bigger impact. Beyond just what happens in the walls of Easter Seals, it's time to make the impact for the entire community.
There is an opportunity to help families and to help children and to change lives.
That is such a great video. It always touches my heart. So you will be able to access and share this webinar and find more information about the ALEX program at the Central Illinois Easter Seals website under our programs. You can watch Alex's story. His picture is on the screen right now, as well as other children that have CVI. You'll be able to find resources and then read about our team. Okay, we would like to thank you for your attention, and we want to really strongly encourage you. You'll receive an email that will have a survey in it, and we would be so grateful if you would answer and post the survey so that we can better plan our next webinars and serve you and your needs in the future. So we really hope to continue to work with you as we move forward. Thank you very much.